This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Welcome to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you for listening. My guest today is Professor Daniel J. Mahoney, and our topic is the work of the great Russian writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn is one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and as a young man, he was arrested and put into the Soviet prison system, the Gulag, and it was during this time in prison that he had a profound transformation. He wrote a number of novels, including First Circle and Cancer Ward, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And his work, especially that of the Gulag Archipelago, is a profound investigation into human nature, human freedom, especially in the face of evil and oppression. And my guest today to discuss the work of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is the great Dan Mahoney. Dan is a first-rate scholar, and I'm grateful for his willingness to take time to come on the podcast. Dan is a professor of politics at Assumption College. He received his BA from the College of Holy Cross and his MA and PhD from the Catholic University of America in political science, where he wrote on the French political and social philosopher Raymond Aron. In 1999, Professor Mahoney was the recipient of the prestigious Raymond Aron Prize. He is an associate editor of Perspectives on Political Science and the book review editor for Society magazine. He's a renowned expert on French political philosophy, and his books include the critically acclaimed Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology, books on Raymond Aron, Charles de Gaulle, Bertrand de Juvenal, and a more recent book which we'll discuss, The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth about a Misunderstood Thinker and Writer. Dan also has a newer book out on the problems with humanitarianism called The Idol of Our Age. I highly recommend everything that Dan writes, so do go out and buy his books. They are well worth it. So today, we're going to talk to Dan about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, his importance and relevance for today, and some of the key insights from his work, especially that of the Gulag Archipelago.
Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I think we met now about 10 years ago, something like that. I
think that's about right.
At Acton University, and I think you, or maybe it was a Liberty Fund, and I heard you talk on Tocqueville. But actually, I knew your work before that for a number of reasons, but because when I was teaching undergraduates, I used the collection you edited, Raymond Aron's Main Currents on Sociological Thought. And so I remember using that and always enjoy hearing you lecture. So I'm very happy you're here. So you're incredibly widely read. Anybody who knows you knows I could ask you questions on everything from Aron to Tocqueville to Nisbet to Karl Marx and so on. But today what I'd like to do is focus on the work of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and maybe if we have time, talk a little bit about Alexis de Tocqueville at the end. And hopefully I get you to come back and talk about Tocqueville. So we'll see how
that sounds great.
So let's begin with Solzhenitsyn and the basics. Okay, so he was a young man. He was a Marxist, communist, not a believer. He was in the Russian army, and he wrote a letter, right, that was a bit critical of Stalin, and he found himself in the prison system in the gulags. And this experience over time had a tremendous intellectual, spiritual, and moral impact on him into like a deep conversion, both religiously, but intellectually, morally. And many people have said that his book, The Gulag Archipelago, was one of the major forces bringing down the Soviet Union. So can you tell us a little bit about Solzhenitsyn, maybe a brief overview, and then also how you got interested in him?
Okay. Well, there's a lot to talk about there. One of Solzhenitsyn's biographers subtitled his biography, A Century in a Life. And I think that really conveys just how momentous Solzhenitsyn's life was. A French biographer talks about 7 stages in Solzhenitsyn's life. You mentioned a few of them. He was actually brought up by an Orthodox Christian family. His Aunt Irina raised him as a Christian. But when he was a teenager, he joined Komsomol, and he remembered a dramatic moment when he tore the crucifix that his family had given him off of his neck. This was an explicit act as a teenager, repudiation of the faith of his fathers. And in one of his autobiographical poems, Solzhenitsyn describes himself in his honeymoon in the early 1940s getting up early to read Das Kapital. So there was a period in which Solzhenitsyn saw himself as a partisan of Bolshevism, of the revolution of 1917, when he began writing the very first chapters of what would become August 1914, his great cycle of books on the Russian Revolution, The Red Wheel. He wrote as somebody who wanted to celebrate the revolution. But you're absolutely right. The turning point came when he was arrested for corresponding with a high school friend, where they both shared not so veiled criticisms of Stalin, but still in the name of a pure Marxist-Leninism. And Solzhenitsyn always said that the scales fell from his eyes when he was arrested in 1945. He began hearing serious arguments in the prisons and camps for those who were much better educated than him, who were much more open to traditional theological and philosophical reflection. He, of course, meditated on the cruel and tyrannical character of the Soviet regime as it had been revealed to him. I think in the period from his arrest in February 1945 to, let's say, the early 1950s, there was a clear movement away from Marxism, a clear repudiation of communism and all its works. He arrived at a somewhat skeptical and open position that's best represented by the character Nurzhin in the novel In the First Circle, which is set in 1949. But by 1952 or so, and this is brought out beautifully in probably the best and central chapter of the Gulag Archipelago, The Ascent, Solzhenitsyn talks about believing again. God of the universe, I believe again. And it was really his reflection on the drama of good and evil in the human soul that had awakened him to certain spiritual resources that he had thoughtlessly repudiated as a young man. So there were certainly further intellectual and political developments in Solzhenitsyn's self-reflection, but I would say during his period of imprisonment, 45 to 53, there's a clear movement, first away from Marxist-Leninism and then toward a more explicit Christian affirmation. But I would say that Christian affirmation is not merely pietistic. It was also a recovery of a classical philosophical understanding of the human person and the human soul.
I have a question, following on that. You just talked about the chapter of the Ascent. And
yes,
he has, so maybe I was going to ask you about that later, but maybe we go to it now, because I think maybe it'll lead into, I think, where you were going about this idea of not just simply a pietistic conversion, but a deep intellectual and moral conversion as well. So he's talking about in the Ascent, like right around that time where he says, God of the universe, I believe. He said, right after, he says, looking back, I saw my whole conscious life, I had not understood myself or my strivings. And so he began to kind of understand. And there's this moment where he says, the result is what counts. This is what he had been told by every group. He said, not just by the socialists, right, but by Tsarist Russia. By the whole modernity says the result is what counts. And he realized in the prison camps that, well, no, it's the spirit that counts. And that if you were going to survive, you had to choose between either surviving at any price and thereby betraying your conscience and your humanity, or survive by adherence to the truth and against a lie. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you've actually given a superb summary of some of the key themes and affirmations in the Ascent. But I think that's right. Solzhenitsyn's rejection of communist ideology also entails a radical questioning of many modernist presuppositions or many ideas that undergird the modern project. And one of those is the idea that what ultimately matters, what ultimately has efficacy, is success. And I think Solzhenitsyn came to reject, he would later articulate this in a much more developed form in later essays and speeches from the 70s and 80s onward. But he rejected the ideology of progress, or especially the idea that technological and material progress was coextensive with an increase in wisdom and goodness in human beings. That he repudiated. And I think you said it very, very nicely. Solzhenitsyn saw that every prisoner, every zek, as they were called, the zeks, were faced with a choice. And the choice was to survive at any price, which Solzhenitsyn says very succinctly was fundamentally a choice to survive at the expense of others, or one could choose the path of conscience, of personal integrity, of commitment to truth. And that meant one might not survive. One might survive. But Solzhenitsyn, as a character in the first circle says, had come to the conclusion that we only have one conscience. You know, you might say the modern ethos, best expressed by somebody like Thomas Hobbes, is that the great desideratum is self-preservation, and we only have one life. But I think Solzhenitsyn had concluded early on that much more important than that was the fact that we only have one conscience, and that we are obliged to be caretakers of our souls, to polish our souls, to defend it as our most precious property. And so I think that before Solzhenitsyn returned to a more explicit or emphatic Christian affirmation, he first arrived at this moral vision and this view of the human person. There's two beautiful passages. These chapters are really a diptych, you know, they belong together. A chapter in volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago called The Blue Cap, and the chapter called The Ascent, and the central of the 7 sections of the Gulag Archipelago called The Soul and Barbed Wire, which begins with a quote from Corinthians, "Let me show you a mystery about how we will all be changed." But in any case, in both of those chapters, Solzhenitsyn speaks about learning the falsehood of the Manichaeanism, the ideological Manichaeanism promoted by the Bolsheviks, that evil was out there in a suspect class or group. And if only that suspect class or group, the bourgeoisie, the aristocrats, the Christians, the kulaks, were eliminated, then all would be well. And Solzhenitsyn came to discover through suffering and through self-knowledge and reflection that the line between good and evil divides every human heart, that it's impossible to expunge evil in its entirety from the world, as all modern ideological projects attempt to do, and that when human beings, the one true progress, as Solzhenitsyn once put it in a later piece, is the possibility for spiritual self-improvement on the part of individuals. And that means no longer accepting the cop-out that evil is something that happens to us, that we have personal responsibility, that it's possible for a human being to choose good and to repudiate evil without ever overcoming what, in the language of theology, we might call original sin. So I think many readers of the Gulag respond to those passages, I think, because they speak not only to the specifics and the evils of communist totalitarianism, but to certain basic verities about the drama of good and evil in the human soul.
All right. So it's interesting because it has these deep personal and political and social impact. So, like, for example, if you think evil is from somebody else, then you're always blaming somebody else and not dealing with yourself, right? And that's what we want to do. I mean, I'm always looking for somebody else to blame. Trust me. And I tell my children, we kind of almost joke about it, like, you can go from knowing you did something wrong, just lying to yourself that you really didn't do it wrong, to blaming others, to blaming the universe. And it has fast.
That's right.
But it also has deep political impact, which is that, and one of the things I say, tell me how you react to this, is like one of the real distinctions between, say, a Jewish or Christian understanding of evil is that evil comes fundamentally from us, right? Was the famous line of Chesterton, "What's wrong with the world?" He said, I am what's wrong with the world. And
that's right.
The kind of Rousseauian, Marxian, ideological modernity that somehow human perfectibility is possible if we can remove we can change the political or social structures or economic structures, everything will fall into place. And really the kind of Jewish and Christian position says, no, you can't. You can't create heaven on earth. And Solzhenitsyn's, I think, this deep realization and then his I think, existential explanation of how evil is in our heart, I think is a very powerful thing. Now, I want to...
I think that's all very well said. And I think what's so powerful about Solzhenitsyn's accounts are they're precisely personal and experiential,
right?
But they give rise to a larger, you might say, philosophical or theological claim about moral and personal responsibility and about the permanence of evil, but also the capacity of human beings to address it and overcome it. And also, as you also alluded to, his discussions and analyses have immense implications for taking on the grand ideological projects of modern times, which are precisely based upon a denial of intrinsic evil in the human soul, always wanting to externalize and locate evil in suspect groups, in real or imagined enemies of the people. And then one is given permission by some inexorable logic of history to commit genocide against those who are deemed intrinsically evil simply because of their origins or simply because of their place in society. What the Nazis did for the Jews, what the communists did for the kulaks and the bourgeoisie. And so, yes, I think these chapters manage at the same time to be a deeply personal account of Solzhenitsyn's own conversion to the moral law, conversion to the Christian faith, but also have immense implications for political understanding and for moral and political philosophy. So together, I think they're very powerful statements.
Yeah, and also, not simply related to a Christian. I think a non-Christian can understand this, especially because of the personal element. I'd like to ask you a question following on that. It's actually one of my notes, is that you've already started touching on it. So let's go there. Is one of the key themes of Solzhenitsyn is this deep critique of ideology. That ideology became the vehicle for people to justify great evil, as you talked about. And he kind of, and one of the quotes on one of your essays that you write, you start with that quote, and it's not in front of me right now, but how Shakespeare's bad guys are not half as bad as the ideological bad guys, because this becomes rocket fuel for hatred and for resentment, but also rocket fuel for this kind of new Tower of Babel, that we're going to build heaven on earth, and that our ideology gives us then permission to do any sort of evil as long as it's in the service of creating this new Tower of Babel. Could you develop a little bit how Solzhenitsyn?
Sure. I think Solzhenitsyn is absolutely brilliant and indispensable when he writes about the way in which ideology intensifies evil and violence. I think the quote you were referring to is the quote from the chapter on the Blue Caps, where I can read it. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's villains stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives villainy its long-sought justification, and gives the villain the necessary steadfastness and determination. I skip a few lines. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience villainy on a scale calculated in the millions. So there, Solzhenitsyn is making very clear that there's this tremendous amplification of violence and terror made possible by the ideological justification of tyranny.
Right, and he says, to interrupt real quickly, he says right after that, which is very powerful, right from this kind of big abstract critique of ideology, he says, how then do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? Who was it that destroyed these millions? Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago.
And compare this to so much of our social science, which speaks about systems, and abstract and impersonal forces that are responsible. There's a whole literature on totalitarianism, even about Nazi Germany, where people give structural explanations for the Holocaust or for the concentration camps, that, somehow no one in particular was responsible for this. I think the spirit of Solzhenitsyn would be much closer to the argument of Milton Himmelfarb in a beautiful piece in Commentary magazine years ago. He put it very succinctly: no Hitler, no Holocaust. That there was a volitional choice for mass murder and evil rooted in ideological presuppositions. And you can't make sense of the Holocaust. You can't make sense of Gulag. You can't make sense of the actions of Lenin and Stalin and Hitler unless one understands this connection. This connection between ideology and the amplification of terror or villainy, as Solzhenitsyn puts it.
So following just a little bit more on that before I move on. So I'm an admirer of Eric Voegelin. We've talked about it. I'm a big Voegelin fan.
We have talked about Voegelin,
yeah,
yes.
And he talked about this ideology and this kind of like Gnostic influence in modern politics that would justify any evil. Maybe do you see an overlap with Solzhenitsyn and Voegelin? And I think B, how both of them take structure, ideas, and personal responsibility seriously.
Absolutely. There's a huge similarity, and I know from reading Voegelin's autobiographical reflections, which are a wonderful book that he spoke and wrote with great admiration about Solzhenitsyn. The language of Gnosticism is not part of Solzhenitsyn's working vocabulary, but the same insights are there, as you just made clear. This confidence that that heaven can be created on earth, this Manichaeanism, where some are associated with the camp of the good, the Revolutionary Party, the Transformative Party, and others, the victims, the enemies of the people, must be purged or destroyed for the sake of creating a wholly different world. I think one thing that Solzhenitsyn and Vogl have in common is they both hold on to a very unfashionable notion in the intellectual world and the academy today, and that notion is human nature. But they're also Solzhenitsyn is a critic of every form of progressivism, the idea that human nature can fundamentally change and that history has some logic leading us to another order of things. I think what Vogel would identify with ideological Gnosticism. On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn, I think this is true of Vogel, and always held on to hope. That God's grace, the human soul can participate in what Voegelin called the divine ground of reality. That human nature endures. As I put it in one of my pieces, human nature is stronger than ideology. It's one reason why 20th century European totalitarianism collapsed. But I said God's grace is stronger than human nature, So human beings we can't transform our condition or nature. We can't build the kingdom of heaven and earth, but we can hold on to hope, and we can find elements of grace that elevate the human spirit and remind us of as I said before, the basic verities, the things that really matter.
It's interesting because it's a pretty depressing book, right? Like overwhelming. And there's times like, I should read Solzhenitsyn. Like, no, I can't handle it. Let me read something else. But at the same time, it's very hopeful. It's a very powerful book that inspires you. Like, okay, I can, if these people, the prisoners, could exercise such humanity and moral seriousness and virtue and excellence in the worst conditions, surely I could do a little bit better in my very easy life.
Absolutely. Solzhenitsyn always said, and this is a point I've reiterated in all my writings about Solzhenitsyn and about the Gulag Archipelago in particular, Solzhenitsyn always said the final note in the work is hope and catharsis. The central section we've already talked about is the soul and barbed wire, Solzhenitsyn's own discovery of self-knowledge and spiritual ascent in the Gulag Archipelago and under unimaginable conditions. And let me remind you, the third volume of the Gulag Archipelago is hopeful in a different way. It's the story of resistance, going back to Lenin's times. It's the story of those who stood up. The 40 days at Kengir, when 8,000 prisoners, politicals and criminals alike, established self-government in a Soviet camp. It's the story of Georgy Tenno, the committed escaper, who time and time again escape from Soviet prison camps, always to be recaptured and always to escape again. And Solzhenitsyn finds something ennobling in his Sisyphean efforts to free himself from totalitarian domination. But the fact that there was resistance, that people did stand up for the truth, is a sign that, to use a phrase of Solzhenitsyn from volume 3 of the Gulag Archipelago, that the sparks of the spirit can never be expunged. And I use that phrase because Solzhenitsyn has subtitled the Gulag Archipelago an experiment in literary investigation. One of the things that literature can do, better than history, better than social science, it can artistically render the life of the spirit. Through artful presentation, it can show how the human spirit responds to the worst circumstances, but at the same time gives evidence of a capacity for self-transcendence. Not to simply survive at any cost, not to simply deny that we are beings with conscience. And this was not the road chosen by all of the prisoners, probably not a majority of the prisoners, but it wasn't a tiny minority current either. As Solzhenitsyn says in one place, it was possible for human beings to hold on to their human countenance.
It's interesting because, again, a little bit of an abstract, but Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who I actually am going to mention again, because I think he has some overlap with Solzhenitsyn I want to talk to you about, but Benedict XVI, he said that in his kind of, he's this wonderful proponent of the importance of human reason and liberty and the connection of reason. He said it was the faith of the martyrs in the 20th century that participated in the convalescence of reason, which is a healing of reason away from empiricism and ideology to an engagement with truth. And it was, in fact, this witness of the martyrs. And I think you see an overlap there with Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, that remark of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI not only beautifully resonates with what we know of Solzhenitsyn, but I think it perfectly conveys his own experience. So, as one of my articles, I quote a great Franco-Swiss Solzhenitsyn scholar, Georges Nivat, who says, with Solzhenitsyn, night or nihilism is never the final word. That light, Solzhenitsyn never for a moment succumbs to despair. There was another great writer on the camps, Varlam Shalamov, who wrote a book, a classic book, as classic as the Gulag Archipelago, called Kolyma Nights, about the camps in the Arctic Northeast. And Kolyma was convinced that the only lesson to be learned from the concentration camps was despair. That human beings are reduced to the status of beasts, that any intrinsic human dignity is undermined or destroyed. Now, Shalamov is an extremely powerful writer. He conveys the terrible crimes that occurred in Kolyma as powerfully as anyone. At the same time, he drew diametrically opposed moral and spiritual and philosophical conclusions from Solzhenitsyn. So it's quite interesting. But in Solzhenitsyn, it was exactly that. The sparks of the spirit, or Benedict wants to call it the faces of the martyr, that rekindled in him a deep commitment to conscience, truth, and justice. Not understood as some vague wave of interiority, but as objective references in human experience. So, to use the language of Pope Benedict, I think Solzhenitsyn's experience also points to the primacy of reason, understood in that capacious Greco-Christian sense of the logos.
So I'd like to move kind of related, because it's involved with Ratzinger again, but another thing that I'd like to talk to you about is Solzhenitsyn's critique of anthropocentric humanism. So it's a little bit of a shift, but that Solzhenitsyn worried. He didn't think there was moral equivalence between the Soviet Union and its extermination of tens of millions of people and the democratic West. That's not what he was saying. But he was worried that many of the same philosophical assumptions about the person, nature, progress, and society dominated the West. And Ratzinger, who at 1991, long before he was Pope, has a quote. He said, quote, "We must, of course, be aware that Marxism was only the radical execution of an ideological concept that even without Marxism largely determines the signature of our century." And Solzhenitsyn had been making this argument at least since the 70s, maybe much before. You would know, but I mean, I think this is one of the themes of his Harvard address, and a lot of people say,
and he returns to it in his sort of valedictory address to the West at Liechtenstein. We have ceased to see the purpose. No, anthropocentric humanism for him was a corruption of liberty and human dignity.
And some people see this as, sorry, it's just so I wanted you to go on that, but some people say, oh, he's anti-West, he's anti-this, but you say, no, he's not. You're missing the point. This is what you're.
Well, I mean, there's powerful, the whole pre-modern Western tradition rejected anthropocentricity, and Solzhenitsyn, like Ratzinger, sees the turn to anthropocentricity as providing no ground for limiting, for controlling, for humanizing this unleashing or emancipation of the human will, this voluntarism that gives rise to unprecedented forms of tyranny. So when Solzhenitsyn criticizes anthropocentricity, he's not criticizing political liberty. He's quite the contrary. He's arguing that when liberty acknowledges something above itself, but liberty then has the moral and intellectual content to achieve the ends and purposes of our created human nature. I think of a beautiful line, one of my favorite quotes from Tocqueville, where he speaks about true liberty. True liberty isn't the deification of the human self. It's not moral anarchy. It's the freedom to live and breathe under God and the laws. So to recognize liberty under God, people forget the very famous passage in the 1978 Harvard Address where Solzhenitsyn praises the American founders for affirming a notion of liberty under God, which he said did not reject the rich reserves of mercy and sacrifice that had imbued the centuries of the Christian West. So in a way, I think Solzhenitsyn, like Pope Benedict, is pointing out that when liberty becomes empty of moral content, when it simply becomes a vehicle for the exaltation of the human will, then it loses its connection with that rich moral capital that was responsible for the glory and greatness of the West. So, yes, I think it's a terrible mistake, these silly, tendentious, oft-repeated distortions of Solzhenitsyn's thought that somehow think his critique of anthropocentrism has illiberal political consequences. It's all nonsense, but it's repeated endlessly despite the criticisms of people like me who try to set the record straight.
Well, and this is one of the themes of the book, which I'll put a link up to, and the other Solzhenitsyn, right, telling the truth about a misunderstood writer and thinker. I'd like to ask you, do me a favor and explain a little bit more. We've kind of thrown out this word anthropocentric humanism, right? And if you're not totally familiar with Solzhenitsyn or Ratzinger, like what is that? Well, explain, what is he worried about? I mean, how could you, let me be like provocative, like, oh, come on. How can you say that the ideas that were radically executed in Marxism are still determine our century, as Ratzinger says, or as Solzhenitsyn says similarly, like, this is a real problem for the West too. Can you, like, what is he trying to get at? What's Solzhenitsyn trying to get at there?
What he's trying to get at is, that liberty needs a proper grounding. And if human beings conceive of themselves as little gods, who are free to make themselves if they confuse human freedom with a form of self-deification, then paradoxically we empty freedom of anything but a groundless willfulness. And so, without the natural moral law, without deference to a creator God, without acceptance of all the evidence around us that points to a natural order of things, we simply give liberty any context it wants. And so pure autonomy or anthropocentrism has ways of very quickly devolving into various forms of human self-enslavement or tyranny. Solzhenitsyn, I'm glad you brought up Vogl, because there's a whole series of Christian and conservative political philosophers over the last century who have essentially made the same argument. And when the stupid journalist responded to the Harvard address as if Solzhenitsyn is speaking as a Russian Slavophile who doesn't know the Western tradition, in ways Solzhenitsyn showed himself to be a much more profound and deeper political philosopher than all his silly ideological critics. So no, if human, I think the question comes down to, is our liberty groundless, or does human freedom serve certain ends and purposes outside of itself that are rooted in the nature and needs and motives of the human soul, and that have something to do with the directedness of the human person or the human soul to the divine ground of our being? And
do you have to be religious, do you think? Do you have to be religious? You talk about the divine ground of your being. I mean, is it an anthropological or theological?
I think a secular reader can read Solzhenitsyn, especially those great chapters on the Blue Caps and the Ascent, which provide a very compelling anthropology about the drama of good and evil in the human soul. I think a secular reader can agree with that analysis largely on the basis of what we might broadly call natural law. But I do think the very language of Solzhenitsyn, the language of ascent, of the soul's self-discovery, of looking upward, I think it points in a theistic direction, but it doesn't necessarily demand a theistic affirmation or an explicit Christian confessional commitment. So, but I would say Solzhenitsyn's insights about the drama of good and evil in the human soul do point in a Christian direction without being narrowly sectarian or confessional. That's probably the most succinct way I could put it.
And some kind of like moderate realism, like you believe the world exists.
Moderate realism. That's right. To use philosophical language, a kind that there really is a structure of reality. You may remember Solzhenitsyn's Nobel lecture, very beautiful text one of my favorite texts of Solzhenitsyn's. But he begins by saying there are two types of writers. One is the modernist who believes we create our own, the writer creates his own autonomous world, so it's a kind of creation ex nihilo. And Solzhenitsyn said there's another kind of writer, and this is the writer that Solzhenitsyn identifies with, and that writer sees himself as a humble apprentice under God's heaven. In other words, he tries to represent the drama of the soul, the structure of the human condition, the aspirations of the human person to truth and justice, the place of conscience, the failure of human beings to live up to the requirements of our freedom and dignity. Those two very different understandings of what the writer is. Right. One sees the writer necessarily affirming a kind of realism. There is a world, and right. the author aims to convey that world, including the drama of the soul. The other sees himself in a much more voluntaristic way as think of the way we more and more see art and writing as being tied to creativity.
Right.
Rather than to a deeper kind, not to say that artfulness isn't.
But not simply creativity. Right. Some reverence for being and reality that you.
That's right.
You didn't create the universe. You just happened to be here in it, and your job is to somehow pull some truth out of it with reverence, as opposed to radically. I think that's perfect.
That author, like Solzhenitsyn, who was a humble apprentice under God's heaven, has some. He has a sort of an ontological commitment to a world that the proper response to which is gratitude for a gift that has been given to us by nature or God. And so it's not our world. We didn't make it, but we have, as Solzhenitsyn puts it in the Nobel Lecture, a profound responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. And that responsibility is inseparably moral and political, of course.
Right. This is of course right out of Genesis, right? So you have responsibility to till and cultivate the garden you're given.
That's true too.
Yeah. Let me. I have a couple more things to ask you before we go out of time. I'm really grateful for your time. One is let's talk about the problem of deceit, right? And he does this, phenomenology of totalitarianism, and he talks about really how deceit not only in the camps but outside of the camps really destroyed human freedom, prepared the way for cruelty, broke apart the family. And you deal with a lot of this in your chapter called A Phenomenology of Ideological Despotism. And this is in your book. The Other Solzhenitsyn. It is. Do you know the number of the chapter? Hold on. It's chapter 5.
I think it's. It's in volume 2 of. Chapter 5 of my book.
Yeah, chapter 5 of your book.
That I might not have been able to tell you, thank you for that clarification.
Well, in this, but you kind of go over. I'll just highlight a couple things to remind you. So you're talking about it's our muzzled freedom. I think
was one of my absolutely favorite chapters in the Gulag, precisely because it provides an unparalleled phenomenology of ideological despotism. Yeah. Not what happened to people in the camps, but what happened to people in free Soviet life. How betrayal and mendacity became systematic forms of existence. Mm-hmm. And it really is, not in the technical philosophical sense, but in the more common sense way of putting things, a phenomenological analysis.
Right. Well, okay, so you have a couple things that are very powerful. I mean, you give an example of, or this is from Solzhenitsyn, right? How everyone was under constant fear. No one would tell the truth, even about their own family members. He tells the story of a boy whose family was deported to Moscow. And when he returned home and went to visit his neighbors, no one would take him in because they didn't want anything to do. And he says,
Solzhenitsyn calls this swinish behavior, absolutely swinish behavior.
And then this is just kind of, it corrupts every part. And you have in this one section, it's page 89 in your book, it's called The Lie as a Form of Existence, right? That you take from this position where he says, Solzhenitsyn believed that systematic mendacity was the defining trait of Soviet despotism, and in fact persisted long after Stalin. And there's a great section where right soon after that where you say, conscience, justice, right and wrong, the constituent elements of the moral universe have been displaced by, quote, primary cliches, right? And
those ideological cliches that dominated all Soviet discourse in politics, at work, day-to-day speech. The French call it la langue de bois, the wooden language. The wooden language of ideology, where artificial language, untruthful language, one lie, one ideological cliche after another replaces the ordinary language of good and evil.
Right. It's like Orwellian newspeak, right?
Absolutely.
So now today we think of it. So here's kind of my question. I mean, to all the listeners, definitely read Dr. Mahoney's book, The Other Solzhenitsyn. It's a great chapter, and of course Solzhenitsyn. But so I'd like you to talk about a little bit about the problem of deceit. But also, we think of this as foreign to us, right? But if we think about it, how many times do we not speak up, or use these cliches in, say, a work situation or a social situation, because, as Solzhenitsyn says, well, we're thinking of our family. We don't want to cause any problems. And are we actually in a similar situation, not as wicked, of course, without the constant fear, but maybe because there's not even fear, we're almost afraid to tell the truth. And this may have bad consequences.
Say that, yeah, I mean, Solzhenitsyn argued over and over again that the twin pillars of ideological totalitarianism were violence and lies. Obviously, in postmodern America or late modern America, we're not faced with systematic violence or systematic mendacity.
Thanks be to God.
But we are faced by a certain kind of political correctness that refuses to acknowledge basic and elementary truths about the human situation, about the current American situation, and I look at the lingo of transgenderism. You know, the refusal to acknowledge any natural order, the idea that people simply choose gender identifications that have no roots in biology, in human nature, in the human condition. This is as mendacious, this is as fraudulent, this is as divorced from the real as anything, and
harmful to everybody. Yeah, harmful to everybody.
Harmful to everybody.
What else do you see?
And back to your point, there's lots of people who know this is nonsense, who know this is corrosive of decent life, of simply seeing the world clearly, who succumb to this kind of language or accept it out of a false notion of getting along or being compassionate or being understanding. I see a lot of this movement in the church under Pope Francis. So it's a real problem. And
sorry, what do you mean getting along? What? I'm sorry. You see a movement to getting along?
I see this drift, this institutionalization and acceptance and forbearance before a politically correct denial of elementary truths. Okay. You see it in the church. You see it outside the church. Lots of decent people go along with these modes of speaking or these categories. Everyone seems to be a participant in gender theory today. The old language of men and women has been thoroughly displaced by an ideologized way of speaking about gender. And now it's more or less taken for granted. If anyone objects, they're seen as, some kind of dinosaur, reactionary. So we too face lies. And our lives, our current situation, the domination of an ever more systematic cultural and moral relativism, the denaturalization of sex and family. I could name other areas of life.
Yeah, what else? What other areas do you see where maybe something that people like? I think that the gender one is very obvious, right? It's just clear.
Yeah, it's very obvious.
But what are maybe some other ones that, because I'm thinking like Solzhenitsyn, he's saying it's also showing up in places you don't know, you're not paying attention to. Where else do you see would be a place where there's like a mendacity? There's something just not true that we've all kind of accepted as true.
Well, I think I'm not that this is the dominant position of the ordinary American, but I think the drift toward cloning, the assumptions of transhumanism, that it is somehow in principle desirable to extend life on this earth indefinitely, that's about as big a lie as you can get from the point of view of either classical philosophy or Christian wisdom or just common sense. And yet, we have a kind of pseudo-scientific establishment that treats opposition to this, what Burke would call metaphysical madness, as rooted in, again, superstition and ignorant religion and this kind of thing. Leon Kass has written...
I was just thinking about Leon Kass.
Leon Kass in his new book, Leading a Worthy Life, Finding Meaning in Modern Life, has wonderful things to say on all these things. I would say in the church, the increasing confusion of Christian wisdom with a soft humanitarianism that asks nothing of us, where we lose focus on the drama of the soul, or we see things, this worldly amelioration, left-wing social justice. I think there's a drift in Catholic circles to a de facto pacifism, that it's never just or noble for free peoples to defend themselves against enemies. We're obliged to love our enemies, not to deny that they exist or to fool ourselves about the threat that they might pose to the most civilized to civilization. And we have people in the highest echelons of the church who tell us that Islam is always and everywhere a religion of peace. Well, that's simply not true. I would say the lie, the big lie, the ideological lie that led to ideologically inspired terror and genocide is not the problem confronting us today, but the ideological lie in terms of a softer moral and cultural relativism, a kind of humanitarianism that makes no real demands, moral or political demands on human beings. That version of the lie, a kind of postmodern mendacity, I think is a real problem for people in and outside of the church.
Leon Kass makes this point. I heard actually in an interview with him on a podcast, but it was about an essay he wrote on the Ten Commandments, and that in one
it's in the new book,
yeah. This Egypt is this model of the modern technocracy, where we're going to control life, control death, control everything. So it's really, and the Tower of Babel, you of course see it, is an ancient desire. I sometimes say, God in the Garden of Eden, he makes us, he creates man and woman, and we're not supposed to try to become like God. We're not supposed to grasp like the Tower of Babel or the Garden of Eden. Nor are we supposed to live like animals. And really kind of the tension is between either we want to live like animals and just with radical, hedonism, or we want to become like God. And I think that I think you're right. I mean, I think it's important that we don't, and I know you're not doing this, but I want to make sure that everybody hears, we're not in any way making light or somehow comparing the enormity, and by enormity I mean monstrous wickedness of the Soviet empire and what they did to millions of people with today, where we have great freedom and we can have this conversation. But what we're saying, I think, following Solzhenitsyn and Ratzinger and Kass and others, is that there is a temptation to this kind of lie about nature, lie about reality, that somehow man can become God. And when that happens and it spreads, it's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, and you can interpret, as Vogelin did, ideology in part as the imposition of a second reality over the human condition or over human nature. And I think in many walks of life, we see it with transhumanism, we see it with transgenderism, we see it with some of the intellectual assumptions undergirding postmodernism. There's a clear elimination of, you might say, the world as we know it through personal experience and common sense, and the literal imposition of an alternative reality over that. So I agree with you. And by the way, everyone misunderstands Solzhenitsyn if they think Solzhenitsyn Solzhenitsyn condemned, as I sometimes see silly commentators say, he condemned the West just as much as he condemned the communist East. He admired the rule of law in the West. He admired its Christian traditions. He admired it, as he made clear in his final speech to the people of Cavendish, Vermont, the traditions of local self-government. In his speeches to the AFL-CIO in the mid-'70s, he praised the generosity and magnanimity of the American people. In his last speech to Liechtenstein, he praised American foreign policy for taking crucial steps during the Berlin blockade with Turkey and Greece and the Truman Doctrine and Korea, that the West, despite all, had a certain steadfastness in standing up to the worst tyrannies in human history. So Solzhenitsyn is a friend of the West who sometimes speaks bitter truths. On the other hand, his critique of totalitarianism is what Gerhard Niemeyer would call a total critique. It's not a partial critique. Communism was intrinsically evil, in violation of what we would call the natural law. The same cannot be said for imperfect liberal democracy, which still has many strengths and still in important respects, you might say, respects human nature, respects the moral law. even if even if there are powerful challenges to both, primarily coming from intellectual circles.
Good. Well, I've taken a lot of your time. I'm really grateful for this. Maybe you could tell me really quickly, people are going to, maybe somebody, if they don't know Solzhenitsyn very well, where would they start? Where do you think they start? Obviously, you said the Blue Caps, the Ascent.
The place to start is the Solzhenitsyn Reader, New and Essential Writings, 1947 to 2005, co-edited by myself and my late collaborator, Edward E. Erickson Jr. 80% of Solzhenitsyn's writings in one form or another are in the Reader. There's a good 100 pages or so with the Gulag Archipelago that highlights all the essential texts of which we've spoken. There are also his prose poems, his major speeches, Harvard and the others I've alluded to today, plus his great essay on repentance and self-limitation. There are excerpts from his novels Cancer Ward and First Things. There are early prison writings going back to the 40s. The book ends with beautiful, luminous prose poems that Solzhenitsyn wrote from the 50s to the 90s, including a prayer for Russia. It actually includes a couple of prayers he wrote. One when he became famous at around the time of the publication of his little novella that changed the world, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and later a prayer for Russia that he wrote in 1997 when Russia was prostrate after the fall of communism and the corruption of the post-communist regime. So every genre, major speeches, the best selections from all his major works, it's all there. The second volume to look to is the authorized abridgment, about 500 pages of the Gulag Archipelago. Since 2007, that has been available in a new paperback introduced by the historian journalist Anne Applebaum. So the authorized abridgment of the Gulag and the Solzhenitsyn Reader.
Good. And I'll recommend your books too.
And recommend my book. And by the way, I do think, if I can pat myself on the back, that my treatment in the other Solzhenitsyn is the fullest and fairest treatment of Solzhenitsyn as a thinker that really gets through this sentiment of distortions and misrepresentations that have accumulated over the years and allow us to return to the source of Solzhenitsyn's own insights. So,
well, and it's accessible. It's serious and accessible. I like it a lot. So good.
And it also contains as an appendix, I have to say, a simply marvelous introduction of the Gulag Archipelago that Mrs. Solzhenitsyn wrote to the 2010 abridgment of that work, which is now required reading in Russian public schools. So that piece by Mrs. Solzhenitsyn is a gem. It's must reading, and it can be found as an appendix in the other Solzhenitsyn.
Great. My guest today is Professor Daniel Mahoney, Professor of Politics at Assumption College. Dan, thanks for being on this podcast, and I hope I can get you to come back and talk about Tocqueville.
Oh, Michael, it was a great pleasure.
Good. Thanks a lot,
We
Dan.
covered a lot of ground.
We did. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.